Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 135 and we have a good one for you today. Today's fish is one of those really cool and very unique fish that personally I was unaware of until I heard about this fish a couple of months ago. And yeah, it was just totally bizarre. I'm like, oh, I've never heard of this. Let's start doing a Fish Friday on it. Did some research. Hey, this is perfect for that Fish Friday. Today's fish that we're going to be talking about is, bam, the Alaska Blackfish. Now, the Alaska Blackfish, or scientific name Dallia pectoralis, again, that's Dallia pectoralis. It is part of the family Aesocidae. Now, I've seen some people put it in Umbridae or in its own family, Dalliidae. But I do believe it is Aesocidae is still the accepted family on this. And Aesocidae, if you don't remember, because we've actually covered this family before, is the family of pikes and pickerels and mud minnows. I do know some people put Umbridae in their own family with the mud minnows. I understand that, but I do believe as of right now Aesocidae is the accepted vernacular. I could be wrong. These are not fish species that I commonly work with, so I do not really keep up on the taxonomic distinctions for pike and pickerel. They are outside of my personal sampling zone, so I don't really keep up with those sort of, like I said, taxonomic vernaculars. In terms of where this is found, you might have already guessed that it is found in Alaska. Sorry, I keep hitting my microphone and I'm sure you can hear it. They are found in Alaska. They're also found in the Bering Sea Islands and found in Siberia, of all places. And yes, they are a freshwater fish. I want to make that very clear. Most of the times when you're talking about fish up in, that sort of area, you're talking about fish that are very easily adaptable and can either be both freshwater and saltwater or a saltwater fish. However, these are in fact a true blue freshwater fish. And where you're going to find these, you're going to find these in really heavily vegetated swamps and ponds, sometimes in river and lakes, but they're almost always found in stagnant waters. Not always, usually found in stagnant waters. So your backward canals, just there's not too many ponds and lakes that have extremely high vegetation up there in the Arctic, but they are around. Now it is a small fish. You can see here's one kind of in relationship to just some common aquarium gravel. You can see he's got this mean grouchy face right there. Just this fish looks unhappy. He's probably incredibly happy. He looks really unhappy. But they average around 10.8 centimeters, which is about 4.3 inches. They can get much larger, in quotation marks, much larger. They can reach up to like 33 centimeters, which is about 13 inches. So larger in, quotations. They're not a large fish, but they do get well above their average size. I mean, you think about it, average size is 10.8 centimeters. They can get up to 33. That means you can find fish 3 times larger, and it's a freak. Now you can see from the pictures, they're usually this dark green on top, maybe brown, with paler on the bottom. They usually exhibit heavy mottling or this blotch pattern. Sometimes it's a little more solid at the top, sometimes it gets heavily blotched here, but they always have that blotch pattern. And then they really basically just look like a mud minnow. If you've ever talked about ever seen a mud minnow, they kind of have these, this very cylindrical body, this thick, wide head. This one has a severe underbite, given that sort of like, I don't know, bulldog face. Yeah, I would call that a bulldog face. You can see the underbite a little bit easier here. Very, just big underbite. But they have these very rounded caudal fins, dorsal fin, anal fin, and then you can see very easily right here they have these lobed pectoral fins. That's a really neat characteristic, and that's because I think these spend a decent amount of time kind of walking on the substrate, so that's almost like a little muscle. But really neat. But something else to note, they have extremely small and pointy pelvic fins. So, basically just like if you search up mud minnow, well, here, why don't I just show you? Mud minnow. To me, they have that sort of general body shape. You can see right here, lobes. You can see this mud minnow right here. Yeah, that's pretty much, what the Alaskan blackfish is. Now, they are a very generalistic feeder. They are known to eat algae, snails, caddisfly larvae. They're primarily going after these very low tier, low niched ecological foodstuffs. But they are known to eat other fish, specifically themselves. They do actually become cannibalistic if they're significantly large enough to eat that. But so they're just basically going after whatever they can. And that's not uncommon up in the Arctic. The Arctic is not a very nutrient-rich ecosystem, so things usually just kind of survive with what they can, and have adapted to do it extremely well, especially during lean times in the winter times. Something interesting to note is the Alaska populations. Well, I should say first, these are relatively short-lived species. The Alaska populations grow faster, so they get bigger and sexually mature faster, but they only live about 5 years. And there's other populations, I believe, on the Siberian side, or in some of the Bering Sea islands, that grow much slower but can live up to 8 years. But even in the long end, you're talking about 8 years. It's not like the Greenland shark that we've talked about, obviously. This is a very important fish for native communities. Native Americans, Native Russians, your indigenous populations, because even though it's small, it's very, very numerous during the winter, which is traditionally a leaner time, like I said, in the Arctic Circle. And so what would happen is these indigenous populations would go out, and these fish, through something that we'll talk about in a minute, congregate in kind of large schools, which allowed for easy catch. So yeah, you're not getting a lot of meat out of one, but you catch 5,000 of them and you got yourself a dang good meal for the village. But yeah, now going back to kind of what I just said, our interesting fact that we're gonna end the video on, and it's kind of a long fact, so you're gonna have to bear with me. The Alaskan blackfish is, to my knowledge, the Arctic's only air-breathing fish. Let that kind of sink in. The Arctic's only air-breathing fish. Apparently, this fish is famous for its ability to breathe actual oxygen. And it doesn't do it like some of the ways that we've talked about before. This fish actually breathes the air through a modified esophagus. The esophagus actually is divided, it's kind of subdivided in there. They have a non-respiratory, I'm not going to say they have a non-respiratory esophagus, but it's more like sections of their esophagus. They have a non-respiratory section, and then they have a respiratory section. The respiratory section has a lot of mucus folding, lot of capillary action through that. So essentially, it's using its esophagus kind of like a lung. It's basically a lung. It's got a lot of folding, and it's wet, and it's mucosa. It's got a lot of mucosal lining on it, which is allowing air to get trapped on there, and it's basically absorbing those the oxygen through heavy capillary action, tons of capillaries, which is essentially how a human's lungs work. Those little air bladders are essentially just chock full of extremely tiny blood vessels that are absorbing the oxygen. It's really, really neat. But what's really interesting is that the respiratory structure says that there was a big reason to do both air breathing and maintaining. It was just really good. Usually when we're talking about air breathing fish, a lot of these air breathing fish actually lose what we have talked about as the swim bladder, which is what a fish uses to maintain neutral buoyancy, because a lot of these air breathing fish are using that swim bladder as their sort of lung. Well, the Alaska blackfish actually retains that swim bladder so that they can actually maintain their buoyancy. These are actually a heavy swimming fish. And the reasoning for that, and I want you to really think about it, what happens in the Arctic, especially in the winter? Ice. That is actually why it maintained its swim bladder. A lot of these fish that don't use their swim bladder for oxygen, these are in your very swampy areas, usually down in like the tropics and things like that. They'll just go up and get their air. Well, this fish sometimes has to deal with ice, and so it has to maintain its neutral buoyancy right under the ice so that it doesn't sink too far and it doesn't waste the time to go up there. And speaking of ice, how are they breathing on the ice? Well, what happens is usually they are hanging out on the bottom, not using that swim bladder. But whenever ice goes over a lake, usually the dissolved oxygen levels in the water, especially at the bottom, plummet. What they'll do is they'll actually then go up around ice breathing holes that are usually pre-existing. Muskrats, beavers, and even fishermen muskrat and beavers just bite holes in the ice for breathing tubes, and that's where these blackfish will congregate. Or if they're living in a place that has some sort of water flow, usually places with water flow have thinner ice, and what will happen, and this is the really neat, they'll school underneath these ice, and what they'll do is they'll actually kind of like eat away at the ice. They will swim up and basically grab a tiny bite of ice and like pull it away, and it creates an actual audible sound, very audible sound that's almost like a snap, a suck, something. And what they're doing, it's just hundreds and hundreds of blackfish going up on this thin ice trying to bite a hole in there, and then whenever a hole is open, they will actually completely school right below the ice and just continually keep flow around that hole, keeping that hole open so it doesn't freeze over. They're very, very tolerant of the cold, obviously. They have survived in water as cold as -20 degrees Celsius, which is about -4 degrees Fahrenheit, for up to 40 minutes. That's insanely cold for a fish to survive. They're just very adapted, because usually when you're up top around these holes, that water is usually a little bit, or not even a little, it's usually quite a bit colder than waters very far away from that hole. So that's actually how it's surviving. It is either using the holes of the muskrats and the beavers, or they're kind of making their own holes just to survive in these thin layers of ice. That's just a really fascinating evolutionary adaptation. But anyway, thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If I don't, please be safe. Have a great day. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you do. I'd really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your loved ones. And peace.